I've been taking a class at Texas Eastern University. Actually, it's an extension class, a graduate level class, and it's being taught in Longview, and it has to do with Family Marital Therapy. That simply means that it's a class for those people who do counsel families with family problems and marriages and all kinds of problems that may come up in a family. You know, a minister sometimes finds himself at a loss, and I certainly have on a number of occasions, in trying to counsel people who are having marital problems or having problems with their young people or whatever it may be within a family setting, not knowing exactly and maybe not having the skill or the tools of how to accomplish solving a problem. Now you think, well, if a minister is ordained and if he has God's Spirit, if he knows the Bible, then he's got the answers. He knows them all, right? And he's got to have the solutions. Well, that's not right. That's not true at all. It's not true any more than if you're a mechanic or you're a carpenter or if you're a farmer. Just because you're baptized and you have God's Spirit, then you have all the skills suddenly you need to fix your car or grow a crop or whatever it may be that you're doing. There are certain skills involved that we need to know about, and of course all the answers are not just in prayer and Bible study and fasting. Certainly those are good things to do if you're having problems, but there are certain specific things that we all need to learn in whatever occupation we're in. And God's Spirit, well, while it helps us to implement and use that knowledge, it does not give us all that knowledge. And I think all of you understand that basically. But this has been a very interesting class, and we've been talking about the stages that a family goes through. Of course, when a couple first gets married, they're in the marriage stage, the first stage of marriage. And, of course, hopefully they're building, until the first child comes along, they're building that relationship. They're really getting to know each other, and their commitment to each other is becoming very deep. And they're learning about each other, their idiosyncrasies, their strengths, their weaknesses, their needs, and meeting those needs. And, of course, then that leads on to the second stage of a marriage, or of a family, really, which is the birth of the first child. And then you launch into this new stage. And of course, the success of the family after the first child is born depends on how good a foundation you laid in the first stage. Then of course the next stage is the third stage, which deals with the rearing of the children, or the individuation, as they say, of the children. This is helping the children in setting a right example and discipline, love, training, opportunity, everything that they need. And this, of course, this stage goes on till the fourth stage, which is the departure of the last child from the family. And then, of course, the family enters another stage. And then the last stage, of course, is the stage that families enter, or marital couples enter, after all the children are gone. And then it's the stage of acceptance or integration of loss. When all the children have gone, maybe you've lost your job, or maybe you retired, maybe you're beginning to lose your health. And, of course, each stage, as you enter a new stage of marriage or family, the success that you'll have in that stage depends on how successful you were in the previous stage. Now, if you go on to having children and having to rear children and all of that without having a good foundation at the very beginning of your marriage, then your success is going to be very limited when it comes to these other stages. And of course, this is why marriages fall apart at all stages, years and years and years after people have been married, sometimes 20, 25, 30 years, because there are basic things lacking in the foundational stages that were laid before. And of course, if we don't lay a good foundation in a marriage, at the beginning of a marriage, we pass our weaknesses on. If we don't solve those weaknesses, if we don't overcome them, we pass them on to our children. We perpetuate our own weaknesses. And not wanting to, but we actually do it because they follow our example. And if we don't overcome those weaknesses, then they have no choice except to copy us. And they will do it. And of course, a lot of people think that, well, we'll have children and the marriage will be better. This will give us something to live for. And that's probably the greatest fallacy and the greatest mistake that people ever make, is to bring children into a marriage situation where the marriage is not solid and it's not well founded. And of course, sometimes people, after they have children, after the children get up certain ages, and they've got a bunch of them maybe, and maybe the husband and wife realize, well, we're never going to solve our problems. We're always going to hate each other. We'll never have the kind of marriage that we dreamed we would have. So let's just quit trying. But we will stay together for the sake of the children. We'll stick it out for the children. And that is a horrible conclusion to come to. Now, I used to think, well, maybe that's better than breaking up. That's better than divorce. But after taking this class and seeing what happens to children brought up in a situation where parents are only staying together for the sake of the children. Now, these studies, this information is based on thousands and thousands of studies of families where they have, looked at and studied and tested the personalities, the character, the behavior of children brought up in a situation where there's hate between the husband and the wife. There's alienation. There's no communication, basically. There's desperation. There's fear. There's conflict as far as what's right and what's wrong. Maybe the husband and wife disagree on what's right and what's wrong, so the child, in effect, gets a distortion of what reality is, of what is real, of what truth is. And so we have what they call pathologies, all kinds of pathologies developing, which means, again, a distortion of reality or out of touch with the truth or whatever it may be. And, of course, we see society full of that type of thing today. Just look around us everywhere, and we can see young people who have no real understanding of what reality is or what truth is or what true values are of what right and wrong is, simply because of difficulties in the marriage situation or in the family. But it is interesting. The teacher, Dr. McClure, was bringing out a point in reference to just what I mentioned about what is the most important thing that parents can do for their children. What would you think it is? If you could write down one statement of what you think is the one most important thing that parents could do for their children, well, you'd say, teach them about God, maybe. Some of you might say that. Some of you may say, well, it's the best thing that you can do for your children is to love them and to discipline them and spend a lot of time with them and give them every opportunity and take them to church. What else could somebody say? What else could you say that is the most important thing you can do for your children? Buy them a new car. No. That, unfortunately, is some of the thinking. But the most interesting thing that they have found, and this is a result of study, is that the most important thing that parents can do for their children is to love each other. They must love each other. And they have found that it is not showing the children more attention, it's not giving the children more discipline or anything physical at all. But they have found in families where children were really, what shall I say? Problems is a mild word for it. Where the child was showing some bad symptoms. He was doing lousy in school. He had very horrible discipline problems. Instead of showing the child more attention, beating him more or giving him more physical and mental, emotional love and so forth, they found that the children improved in every case where the behavior between the parents was different. When they began to show each other more affection and more love and set a better example. Not even doing anything with the child, just setting a better example and loving each other. Now that sounds crazy, but it's true. So this leads up really to what I want to talk about today. And if you could take that concept and expand it a little bit about, parents loving their children as being the best thing loving each other the best thing that they could do for their children, you could say maybe in a broader sense that the most important thing that we can do for the people of the world, for each other, maybe for our own children, in a sense, is to love God. And that would hold true. Then you have to ask, of course, the question, what do you mean love God? And of course, you can't speak of loving God apart from loving each other, can you? Because they're both the same thing. 1 John talks about that to a great extent, that there's no way that you can say, I love God, and not have the same kind of love for your fellow man. There's no way you can say, I love my fellow man, and not have love for God. So they're two inseparable concepts. They're stuck together fast, and there's no way, in a sense, you can tear them apart in that way. But that's what I want to talk about today, about what love is. It's been sung about, it's been written about, it's been talked up, it's been talked about for ages and ages and ages. And of course, I think sometimes we take it for granted, and it seems tragic because it's such a proliferated subject today. In every area you look in, you hear people talking about love, and this stupid program, Love Boat. That is the most ridiculous distortion of love that anybody could ever come up with. It has nothing to do with love. It should be lust boat, if anything. L-U-S-T. But what is love? Is it just a four-letter word, as Joan Baez said in one of her songs? And how important is it? And we need to ask ourselves, do we really possess it? And if you do, how do you know you have love? Do you really have it? And how much of love is feeling or emotion? And how much of it is mental? How much of it is mental? Or is it both? Do we need it? How much of it do we need? And how do you show it specifically? And how do you show it if you don't feel it? All of us run into these questions and have this run up against that roadblock to a certain extent. But love is a definition. You'd be hard-pressed to find anybody that could give you a real, solid, accurate definition of what love is, because it's been so distorted. And I think Satan is to blame for that. It's a very important concept, but yet the definition of it has been totally perverted by society. As I said before, it's come to mean the very opposite of what God meant it to mean. The very opposite. In every way. Barry Manilow has this song out, Feelings, nothing more than feelings, and he's talking about love, and then another song he talks about, goes to the doctor and is asking the doctor to help him get something so he can get the feeling back, because he's lost his feeling. And then Barbra Streisand, my heart's gone to sleep, the feeling's gone, and so love is a feeling to society today. It's an emotion. It's how I feel. It's what I feel in my heart, as it were. And if you got it, you got love. If you don't, then love is gone. It's abandoned you. So it's almost has a mind of its own, if you want to look at it that way. It comes and goes, and you have no control over it. See? So it has a mind of its own, and you're totally helpless. You're totally at the mercy of the emotion or the feeling, the way society looks at it today. We in the church, unfortunately, have reacted against the concept or the idea of love because, we have tried and we have come out of the world. We've come out of many churches that have a false understanding of what love really is. And so we reacted, I think, maybe too strongly against the meaning of love. We shy away from it. We're afraid sometimes to use the term. And, people, even some people supposedly have left the church, some ministers, you've heard probably stories of ministers that left the church because they got off on love. I know I've heard stories like that because, he got off on love. And then he left the church. As if you got to watch out for love, because if you get off on love, then, you're right out there on the tip end of the branch and it's going to break off if you're not careful. So something is wrong with that concept and how that jives up with what Christ had to say about it. Of course, some have said all you need is love and you don't need anything else. And again, this is a Protestant concept. You don't need to keep the commandments. You don't need to obey God. Just have love. And of course, that's just like loving God and loving your neighbor. You can't talk about one without talking about the other. But again, it's difficult even for me sometimes because to talk about the concept of love, and it is a reaction, as I said before, because we're afraid to express it. We live in a society where, we're not afraid to express selfishness or any other emotion. Maybe some emotions we're afraid to express, but love in a very deep and sincere way because we mistrust each other so much. We think, let's show, or somebody's trying to butter me up or trying to put on or something like that. Some people have left the church. I've talked to people before who left the church, quit coming to church because there wasn't enough love. They just said, there's just not enough love in that church. It's too intellectual. And of course, this is the way a lot of people in the world identify us. I met a lady the other day in the class and I told her who I was and what I was, and she said, the first thing that came into her mind, and it wasn't a bad comment, she said, you people seem to be more on the intellectual side. As opposed to what she was saying, as opposed to religions which have more emotion, I suppose. Of course, I took that as a compliment. I said, I hope we are, I hope we do view things more objectively. But there is a place for emotion in the church. There is a place for expression of emotion. You know, I think it was in the book, The Ante-Nicene Fathers, I think that's the right book, where it mentions John. Of course, John was the only apostle that lived out his full life. And John wrote probably more than any of the other apostles on the subject of love. And you've read his writings, his inspired writings, actually God writing through him, and you can see why. But I think it's in that book that they said that here was John coming. People would see John coming. He's an old white-haired man, and it was kind of like John was hung up in a rut. He was in a rut, and people say, "Oh no, here comes John again. He's going to speak on love." So he was identified with that subject, and I guess you could say that was his forte as far as speaking, and he concentrated on a lot, and he thought it was very important. But what we have in society today, of course, and what we have in the church, and the problem we have between husbands and wives and parents and children is that everybody has a different idea of what it is. You see, now typically the husband thinks that love, as far as I'm concerned, is I go out, I get a job, I keep my job, I bring home the bacon, beef bacon, and the beans, and I pay the bills, you know, and I keep the house. I provide for my family. That's the greatest act of love that I can do. And of course, that is love. That is love, and that's the way a man looks at love. But the woman says she has a different idea of what love is. See, she sees love more as an affectionate type of a thing, more of an intimate type of touching, hugging, kissing, that type of thing. And so what happens is the woman is always wanting something from the man. See, her idea of love is different from his idea of love. And so you have people passing each other, as it were. They're missing each other. And of course, what the man wants from the wife in terms of love probably is support, maybe a certain amount of affection, obedience, submissiveness. Make your own list. And so what happens is the woman wants a certain kind of love from the man, and he's giving what he feels that love is. He's doing what he feels like is love. And he says, well, I'm just not that way. I'm not one to show a lot of affection. I'm not one to show a lot of intimate behavior. And he says, I'm that way. I've always been that way, and I don't guess I'll ever change. And of course, that's the biggest mistake that any of us can ever make, is, getting ourselves locked into a position where we can't change or where we can't repent, because that's what it's all about. And God does demand repentance. But of course, we've learned in this class, and I knew it before, but it's come home to me even more, that you have to meet other people's needs in the way that they need to be met. Not in the way you think they need to be met, but in the way they think and they know they need to be met. I could elaborate on that, but I don't want to get into that any more than I have. But what we need really is a common understanding and a broader sense of what love is. And we have to go, of course, to the Bible to get that definition, and it is given very specifically. And yet, even though it's there, I doubt that we really completely have understood it the way we should. And of course, we never will completely understand it the way we should until we're God's. But at least we can try. Over in John 13th chapter of John, I want to start there. Notice I'm reading John. John 13, and beginning about verse 31. And this, of course, is right at the end of the New Testament Passover, or the Last Supper, whatever you want to call it there. And Judas just left out there in the preceding verses. Satan entered into him, verse 27. And dropping down to verse 31, it says, Therefore, when he was gone out, Jesus said, Now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God be glorified in him, God shall also glorify him in himself, and shall straightway glorify him. Verse 33, Little children, that's the way he addressed them, Yet a little while I am with you. You shall seek me, as I said unto the Jews. Where I go, you cannot come. So now I say to you. So I'm saying the same thing to you. You cannot come, in essence, where I'm going. Verse 34, A new commandment I give unto you. Now we think, well, that's not really a new commandment, what he's about to say there, but it is. It says, A new commandment I give unto you, that you love one another as I have loved you. Now notice, how do we learn? How do we learn love? How do you learn to show love? You learn it by example, don't you? And if you don't have an example, you're just not going to learn it. Now, you can stumble around in the dark and you can try different things and bang your head against the wall and hurt yourself and hurt other people. But the easiest way to learn love is copying somebody who is really showing love. And of course, this is what Christ is saying here. He's saying that you love one another after the example I have set for you, after I have loved you. Treat each other with the same love, the same behavior, the same concern that I have loved you with. That you also love one another. By this, very important, by this shall all men know that you are my disciples, if you have loved one to another. The greatest single sign of God's people is right there. The love and the concern that they have for each other. Now, ask yourself this question. Am I known? Is my congregation known? Are we known? If we are known, are we known by that characteristic? By the concern and the love that we have for each other? By our patience, by our tenderness, by our forgiving and loving attitude that we have toward each other. Now, I didn't make that up. I mean, it's right there, isn't it? It's right there. I just read it. Christ said that would be your greatest identifying sign. So, either we've got it already or else we've got a long way to go, don't we? Before we're known for that, maybe. Now, maybe you are known for that, and if you are, then that's good. That's great if people walk up to you and they say, well, boy, you know, what I think about when I think of the Worldwide Church of God is the fact that those people have so much love for each other. I don't know how many times you've heard that, but if you have, that's great. I hope you have. But at least it should be a point of correction to each of us if that's not true in the case of each of us. How would your children who are coming up view your attitude toward the church and toward the brethren of the church? Sometimes we think, well, I can't understand what's wrong with my kids. They don't like church. They kind of seem to be contemptuous of church, of the ministers of the church, of, you know, what goes on at church and the whole concept of the church. Why are they that way? I am so dedicated to it myself. It's so much a part of my life. Well, it's very simple. They hear your complaints. They see your attitude. They see you when you're upset, even though you may not be saying things. They say that we get messages across a lot clearer through our actions than what we're actually saying. And our actions, of course, as the old saying goes, speak a lot louder than words. So a lot of times this is the reason why our children, you know, have the attitude they do toward church, because a lot of times we are not showing the concern for each other. We're not as dedicated as we like to think we are to each other or to the calling that we have. Very important that we examine ourselves in that point and ask ourselves if we are following. Christ said, love each other as I have loved you. Now, do we think about that very often? Think about it in your own case. Think of the things that Christ did. Are we following His example for showing love, or are we showing love the way we think we ought to do it? You know, are we doing it our way? I'm going to do it my way. You know, I know how to show love. I know how to be loving. I'm going to do it my way. Are we actually saying, well, look, I don't know anything about this subject of love, so I'm just going to follow specifically what Christ said about it. And if we're not doing that, I'm afraid we're getting completely off base in every way. In John 15th chapter, continuing here in the same discourse that Christ is giving, the same lecture, the same sermon, I guess, if you want to put it that way, to his disciples immediately before his crucifixion. He's talking about in chapter 15, he said, I'm the true vine, and my Father is a husbandman, and the importance of staying connected to the vine, and how important that is, we well know. Staying connected with the body, not getting broken off, not being, you know, drying up and being broken off and cast into, you know, fire. Dropping on over, though, into verse 10, he said, if you keep my commandments, you will live in my love, even as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide or live in His love. Actually, I skipped verse 9. I should have read that. As the Father has loved me, so I love you. Continue you in my love. In other words, pass it on, he's saying. Pass it on. The Father loved me. I have loved you. Now you love one another. Pass it on. It doesn't end, you know, with my love for you in that way. And I think a lot of times we think it does. That God loved us, and that's all that's important. You know, that's all we need to do. These things have I spoken unto you, that my joy might remain in you, and that your joy might be full. Verse 12, this is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. He said, you are my friends if you do whatever I command you to do. You know, in Christ, notice, Christ was not embarrassed to talk about love. And how often we are to even mention it. You know, we're embarrassed. We kind of, that's icky. You know, and we think, you know, if a man especially were to talk about it, then maybe he's a fairy or something. Whatever terminology is applied to him in this day and age. And of course, our society is a lot to blame for that. And I think that's the reason we've reacted against it. But Christ was not embarrassed to talk about it. But he said, greater love has no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. And of course, we know that to mean a man, your time, putting somebody else's needs before your very own, sacrificing, not to the point, of course, of maybe your own family going needy or anything like that. But of course, Christ set the example, didn't he? He didn't ask his disciples to do anything that he didn't do. He didn't ask us to do anything that he didn't do. He literally laid down on that stake voluntarily. They didn't have to wrestle him down there. They didn't club him over the head, you know, to get him to lie down on the stake when they drove the nails in his feet and in his hands. He did it voluntarily. He literally laid down his life for his friends. Not just his friends. Well, you can think, well, maybe the whole world. He considered the whole world as his friends, ultimately, when they would come to repent. But ask yourself again this question, and look around you, even at your friends here. And I hope we're all friends. Would you lay down your life for your friends? Who would you die for here? Who would you die for here in this room? First of all, would you start there? Well, you say, well, I would die for my children. Definitely I would die for my children. I think all of us would agree to that. And some of us may die for our mates. Some of us may not. I don't know. But extended much further beyond that, it'd be very doubtful if we were really put to the test, if we would lay down our lives, if we would actually die for each other, for our friends. It's very doubtful that we would do it. Of course, you have to realize, well, ask yourself again this question. There was a man on trial in Longview here last week, and he was convicted and sentenced, I think, to death for killing a police officer up there a few months ago. How many of you, of course you'd never be called on to do this, but Christ was, how many of you would go take his place in the death chamber? Now Christ died for somebody that was guilty, that did something wrong. Now you think, well boy, I might die for somebody that was right, and they were about to die wrongly. I might step in, you know, if I really thought a lot of that person. But what about somebody you knew was guilty of some atrocious, horrible crime? Did you know Christ laid down for people like that? Now we're getting into heavy love, if you want to put it that way. You know, if you think about it. That is where it's at. That's almost beyond our comprehension, isn't it? It is mine. You know, that should at least tell us that we've got a long way to go. A long way to go. Sometimes I think we think that we have arrived, you know, at love, and we're there, and we've, you know, just about got it nailed down. But ask yourself some of those simple questions. Christ said, follow my example and do what I do to show love to each other. Are we actually willing to do that? We need to ask ourselves that. Point blank. We need to pray for the strength to be able to do that. Of course, if the time ever came, if the situation ever came up. So, of course, we begin to see that love, part of what love is how we value and esteem what price we put on somebody else's life, isn't it? As opposed to our own life. How much price, how much worth do you put on everybody else's life as to your own? It should be counted worth more. It should be worth a little more. Not just equal, but a little bit more. Paul said, you know, don't be seeking your own. Don't be seeking your own, so much your own dreams, your own wants, your own needs, your own success. But he said, let everybody seek another's. You know, promote the other guy. Push the other guy. Lift him up. Push him ahead. Exalt him. And of course you think, well, if I do that, I'll never get anywhere. Nobody will ever know me or recognize me, or I'll never make it. And it's a Christian principle that works in reverse to what the human mind would actually conclude that it would. Not live by it because they don't, in a sense, make sense. They don't follow sound human logic to think, well, if you gave your life, if you promoted the other guy always, that's going to get you ahead. Well, it won't get you ahead maybe in the short run. But that's not what important is. That's not the important thing. That's not the important point. But at any rate, part of love is how we value, what kind of worth we have or esteem we have for other people. It is outgoing concern. It does involve a feeling. What place, in a sense, again, do others occupy in our thoughts? Ask yourself that. How much of the time are you thinking about yourself, your own comforts, your own wants, your own needs? And a lot of times, you think, well, I'm not thinking about that so much. I don't want so much for myself. But a lot of times we spend a lot of time thinking about our problems and how bad we are. And that's the same thing. That's just as bad as thinking, promoting yourself and having selfish thoughts, even when you're concentrating on your own problems. Think about that. Love does involve doing for others, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, but it is much, much, much more than just doing for others. I'll prove that to you in a little bit. The classical church definition for love, I suppose, Mr. Herbert Armstrong's own definition, is that love is outgoing concern. It is outgoing concern. Now, that is true. That is very true. But there is more to it than that. Turn over to 1 John 5:3, and this, of course, if I were to ask you what scripture would you turn to define love in the Bible, almost all of you would turn to the scripture. 1 John 5:3. Verse 2, it says, "By this we know that we love the children of God when we love God and keep His commandments. For this is the love of God, that we keep His commandments, and His commandments are not grievous," or they're not hard to keep. And so when people say, well, what is the definition of love? We say it is commandment keeping. It is keeping the 10 Commandments. It is keeping the 10 Commandments. Let's turn back over to Exodus and see if that's all there is to love. Over in Exodus 20. Just look through at the 10 Commandments here. By themselves, nothing else. 10 Commandments as they were given. Of course, I'm not saying that 10 Commandments are incomplete or anything like that. Now, we've said, the first 4 commandments deal with our relationship with God, and the last 6 summarize our relationship with our neighbor, and that's very true. In Exodus 20 and verse 3, and I'll just skim through them, it says, "You shall have no other gods before me." We understand that. Verse 4, "You shall not make unto yourself any graven image." In other words, don't have any idols, whether it's your car, or whether it's your bass boat, or your home, or any idol, living or inanimate, whatever. In verse 7, "You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain." Verse 8, "Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy." So, then we move on down to verse 12. "Honor your father and your mother." In other words, don't do anything to hurt them or hurt their reputation. Honor them in that way. Don't turn out to be a failure, a flop in life. Verse 13, "You shall not kill." Verse 14, "You shall not commit adultery." Verse 15, "You shall not steal." Verse 16, "You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor." And verse 17, the last one, "You shall not covet." Don't want what belongs to your neighbor. Don't want what somebody else's approach is. Desire is. Now we think, well, if we keep these 10 Commandments, that fulfills our responsibility, doesn't it? Because that's what God said. This is the love of God, that we keep His commandments. And if I'm keeping the commandments, I am fulfilling my responsibility. But that is not all there is to it. That is only about 50% of it. And if you could put a percentage on it, I don't know what kind of percent it would be. Now, if you think about the 10 Commandments as we've just read them, you can think, well, how, in a human sense, would be the best way for me to keep these commandments? First of all, I would renounce all physical things. I would get rid of as many worldly possessions as I can, so that I won't worship any of those things. I'll get rid of all of my physical belongings, except what I just have to have. Then I'll have those things that are just kind of bland and, that I won't get hung up on. Then, I'll keep the Sabbath day. I won't work, and you carry through. I won't ever say you take God's name in vain. Then come down to the last 6, which deal with your neighbor, and you say, well, I won't steal, I won't commit adultery, with my neighbor's wife or whoever. I won't kill, I won't bear false witness, I won't lie, and I won't covet. Now, the best way for me to do that is stay away from my neighbor. Don't put myself in the way of temptation. Just get away from it, get out somewhere, isolate yourself. And so you won't be lusting after whatever's there to lust about. You won't be tempted to steal what is his. You won't be tempted by his wife. You won't be tempted to covet his possessions or to lie about him or any of those things. So what this approach, this human approach, says a lot for is a lot for the monastery, doesn't it? It says a lot for being a monk or a hermit. And of course, thousands upon thousands of people have literally come to that same conclusion. And we think, well, that's the best way, just to stay away from people, and that's the best way we can show love, is stay away from them. Because if you're with them, you're going to be tempted, and you're going to hurt them, and you're going to break the 10 Commandments, so let's just stay away from them. I want to read you something from the New Morality, about page 60. Well, actually starting on 59. It's the subtopic, Augustine Embraces Catholicism. I don't know how long it's been since you've read this, but it is interesting, some of the comments that are made here. Now, Augustine, of course, he was one of the fathers of the Catholic Church and one of the fathers of the monastic order, as it were. But notice his conclusion, and this is a human conclusion we've come to as far as commandment keeping, and see if it really fulfills God's expectation for us as far as how we should show love. Listen to this. It says, the mental struggle now going on within him was becoming intolerable. Now, a lot of us have mental struggles, with sin. He says, the thought of divine purity condemned him for his equally strong love of the world and sensuality. All that held him back from now embracing Catholicism was his inability to control sex and live in continence. It was in the summer of 386 that he received a visit from a Catholic compatriot named Pontitian. He was shaken deeply to learn from Pontitian that 2 young officials, both engaged to be married, had suddenly turned their backs on the world and had entered on a monastic life. Conscience-stricken, Augustine ran out into the garden, flung himself under a fig tree, and a passionate burst of weeping seized him. He seemed to hear a voice. It bade him, quote, take up and read. He procured a Bible. As most religionists, churchmen, and the clergy of this world do, he took a single brief passage of Scripture by itself, without regard to context, imputing to it his own meaning. The ministers of this world's Christianity quote certain isolated verses from the Bible regularly. In many cases, they impute to these a meaning entirely at variance to the real meaning of the passage in the context. All the while, they studiously avoid numerous other passages which clearly and plainly teach the very opposite of the meaning they're attempting to read into the passage they do quote and wrongly interpret. The passage to which Augustine happened to turn was Romans 13, verses 13 and 14. Quote, let us walk honestly as in the day, not in rioting or in drunkenness, not in chambering or in wantonness, not in strife and envying. Put you on the Lord Jesus Christ and make not provision for the flesh to fulfill the lust thereof. Augustine said later, I had neither desire or need to read any further. As I finished the sentence, as though the light of peace had poured into the heart, all the shadows of doubt dispersed. Thus hast thou converted me to thee, as no longer to seek either for wife or other hope of the world. There was absolutely nothing in this passage on which his eyes had lit which forbade a man to seek a wife, or any other such teaching of the Bible. There was positively nothing in this passage which suggested celibacy or a life of retiring to the seclusion of the monastery. Neither this passage nor any in the Bible teaches that Christians must leave the world. There is nothing in the Bible to justify the monastery system. Rather, in Christ's own real Lord's Prayer in John 17, Jesus prayed thus for his followers. I pray not that you would take them out of the world, but that you should keep them from the evil. Actually, he commanded his church, go you into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. But Augustine's mind was filled with ideas, convictions, and philosophies, absorbed from Manichaeism, from the skeptics, from the Neoplatonists, pagan thinkers and philosophers, and his own stricken conscience. Therefore, to such a troubled mind, this biblical passage was falsely interpreted to mean, Withdraw from the world entirely. Do as these two men had done, flee from the world into the seclusion of hiding. This actually did more to firmly establish the monastic system in Roman Catholicism. I deem it well that the reader realize how some of these pagan ideas, teachings, and practices came to be accepted as Christian, though they are in fact the very antithesis of real Christianity. So I read that to point out that human reasoning, without God's Spirit, and without really understanding the intention of God, is that the best way to love God, the best way to love your fellow man, is to stay away from Him, to avoid Him. You know, you think about the Ten Commandments, what it says there, and basically in the Ten Commandments, is don't hurt anybody else. It doesn't say anything about going out and doing anything for anybody else. It says just don't hurt anybody else. One place it says, you know, that the commandments do no harm. You know, the commandment keeper does no harm to his fellow man. Now that's true. But, you know, that says a lot for a person who stays away from people. That's the best way to do nobody harm, is to stay away from them, to isolate yourself. So really, that cannot possibly be or mean what Christ meant exactly over in 1 John 5:3, as John was inspired to read it. Over in Luke 17, I'll show you exactly what I'm talking about here. Now, I'm not saying, you know, certainly we must keep the Ten Commandments. We're commanded to keep the Ten Commandments, but the Ten Commandments form only a foundation. A foundation, just like a stage. Just like I was talking about the stages in marriage. Commandment keeping is a foundation upon which we build and go beyond that. And of course, if you only have a foundation and nothing on top of it, you know, you're not completing, in a sense, you're building. You're not finishing the project that you started out. Look at it this way. Think of a lake that has a dam on it that is a hydroelectric plant in the dam, where the water has to go over the dam and down through the generators in order to generate power, you know, to light the cities or whatever. Now think about it this way. If the water never goes over the dam, you know, what good is it? It's not any good, is it? Now think about the Ten Commandments as being all the water in the dam up to the point, just before it goes over. Think about keeping the Ten Commandments. There's all the water in the lake up to the point, but it never goes over. Now think about what Christ said in Matthew 5, I believe, in verse 17. He says, "I've not come to destroy the law, but to fill it up." Now think about it in terms of the lake. You've got to fill it up before it can go over, right? Before it can run the generators, before it can generate the power that it needs to have. Now certainly you can't have love or power being generated from a lake that's not even filled up. So you've got to have that, don't you? And so that's what I'm saying about the Ten Commandments. The lake is full up to a certain point. But Christ said, fill it up. Fill it up so it can go over. It's got to be outgoing. It's got to be overflowing if it is going to accomplish its purpose. It's not just enough to have a full lake in this particular case. It's got to overflow. It's got to overflow if it's going to be any good or any use. In Luke 17, we read about the unprofitable servant here. Verse 1, he said unto his disciples, "Is it possible? It is impossible, but that offenses will come," and so forth. "Take heed to yourself. If a brother trespass against him, rebuke him. If he repent, forgive him." Then he talked about how many times we were to forgive those who trespass against us. Again, that is a very specific point. I won't elaborate on it, but it's a very specific point that we must do. Now a lot of times we think, well, I can go God one better. I know better. This is an exception in this case. Or that's what we want to be. We all want to be exceptions. We all want to make our particular situation an exception, don't we? To where we don't have to follow step by step in the footprints of Jesus Christ. 1 Peter 2:21. What does it say there? Follow in the steps of Christ, in His steps. It didn't say just follow generally the same trail. It didn't say just pick your own way. It said follow in the steps and the specific things that He did. And of course, one of the specific things is to forgive your brother an unlimited number of times if he turns and says, "I'm sorry." He says, "I did wrong. I sinned again. I did it again." We're to forgive. And of course the apostles, as I said before, this is a concept that their minds had a hard time getting a hold of. They said, "Man, Help us to have faith in that. Increase our faith where we can do that. Of course, they had no means whereby at all they could fulfill that, especially without God's Spirit. In verse 6, and the Lord said, if you had faith as a grain of mustard seed, say to a sycamore tree, be plucked up and be thrown into the sea. It says, but in verse 7, but which of you having a servant plowing or feeding cattle will say to him by and by, when he has come from the field, go and sit down to eat? And will not rather say unto him, make ready wherewith I may eat, and gird yourself and serve me, till I have eaten and drunken, and afterward you shall eat and drink. Does he thank that servant because he did the things which were commanded him? I think not. Now what he's talking about, he's talking about you and me as servants. If we are doing our duty, the Ten Commandments, if we're obeying God in the Ten Commandments, we're doing our duty. Do we deserve any thanks for that? No, we don't. God doesn't owe us any thanks if we're doing our duty. We're doing what we were commanded. He says, I don't think he deserves any thanks. Verse 10, so likewise, when you have done all those things which are commanded you, say we are unprofitable servants. We have done that which was our duty to do. Our duty to do. We're up to the point. See, we have laid a foundation when we've done our duty. But if we don't go beyond that, we're as useless as a hydroelectric power plant on a lake that can't spill over any water into the generators. We're not doing anything. We're just there. We need to ask ourselves, how much are we going above and beyond just what God says it's our duty to do? Are we unprofitable? Are we profitable? What are we generating? Again, the commandments, the Ten Commandments, are a foundation, an essential. They must be there. You can't go on to show love without that foundation. But the foundation is not the end of it either. Over Matthew 19, and I'll show you another example here, one that you're very familiar with. Same exact situation. Verse 16, it says, behold, one came and said unto him, good master, what good thing shall I do that I may have eternal life? And he said unto him, why do you call me good? There is none good but one, and that is God. But if you will enter into life, if you want to live successfully, if you want to stay out of trouble, if you want to be, a prosperous individual, keep the commandments. He said unto them, which? And Jesus said, you shall do no murder, you won't commit adultery, don't steal, be an honest man, don't bear false witness, honor your father and your mother, love your neighbor as yourself. The young man said unto him, all these things I've done from, I was a kid. I was brought up obeying the Ten Commandments, he said. Now notice, Christ didn't say, well, that's enough, bud. You've got it made. If you've been keeping the commandments and you're keeping them, you have got it made. He didn't say that, did he? Jesus said unto him, if you will be perfect, if you want to go above and beyond, if you want to overflow, as it were, go and sell what you have and give to the poor, that you shall have treasure in heaven, and come and follow me. Come and follow me. So commandment keeping, being good is just not enough. Being good. You can be good without hurting anybody. And you can be good, you can be righteous without ever, getting in anybody's way in a strict legalistic sense. Can't you? You can be good. You can live alone and be good, according to what the Ten Commandments say. But you haven't done anything good. You haven't gone above that. You've only done your duty, which is not praiseworthy and it's not thankworthy in the least. But Christ said, if you want to fill up the measure of the law, if you want to fill it up, come and walk in my steps. Do the things that I am doing. Follow my example. You see? Follow my example and do the things that I'm doing, even to the point of being willing to lay down your life, which all the apostles did except one. Every one of them died. Every one of them followed, in a sense, in that way, in the footsteps of Jesus Christ. And they laid down their lives. Some of them voluntarily. Some of them didn't have to. Certainly Stephen didn't have to give the hellfire and brimstone type sermon that he did there. He could have gone a little bit easier, I suppose. And God may not have, condemned him for it. But he gave a scorcher of a sermon to those people there, and of course they killed him. And that death was precious in the eyes of God as far as that goes. But this young man, who could have been an apostle, when the young man heard that, he went away sorrowful because he had great possessions. And I think that's the way it is a lot of times with all of us. Our love and our dedication to ourselves and our own righteousness is much greater than any concern or dedication we have to anybody else. It's just a big thing. And then he went ahead to say in verse 23, the richer a man is, the harder it is for him to give up those things in order to be in the kingdom of God. And how very true that is. That's true of all of us. The more that we have, the more that we have to give up. You know, I remember this lady that I visited in St. Louis in a nursing home. I may have mentioned her before, but every time I think about it and think about the widow's mite, I think of her because I walked into that wretched nursing home which stunk to, the clouds. And it was just a horrible place. And people were not very well cared for there, but I received this letter from this lady, and she wanted to visit. So I went there, and I made my way all the way down to the end of the hall into the room on the end. And I found her. And of course, if you walked in and looked around, you'd know her immediately. Because she was sitting there. Her face was aglow. She had a pleasant look in her eyes and a smile on her face. And she was sitting in a reclining chair. And she didn't see me, but I walked over to her. And I introduced myself, and of course she just lit up even more. But her name was Iola Royal, and she was so crippled with arthritis, she could hardly hold anything in her hands. Virtual knots her hands were. And her feet and her legs and knees were so crippled she couldn't bend her knees. She couldn't stand on her feet. They were just knots. And she had arthritis in varying degrees since she was 16 years old. And so she sat there and she had read every booklet that had ever come out, every article, every plain truth, and she was a diabetic too, so her eyes were terrible. She had this huge, thick magnifying glass, that she read with, and she would hold that book about like that, and go from word to word. Of course, that's all she could do, just sit there and read. And of course, she was overjoyed that I would come to see her. She was just, in tears. And so I began to visit her quite regularly. And she began to tell me about her life and everything. She wanted to be baptized. And I searched for a full year before I found a place where I could baptize her. I had a terrible time. And that's the whole story in itself. I approached half the ministers in that town, and they all refused me, even after I told them the story. They wouldn't let me use any facilities they had because they were afraid it would upset their people. And really got in trouble with a Baptist minister on that. He really got volatile about the whole situation. And finally, I took a horse trough or a water trough and set it up in the garage of a funeral home, and I had an ambulance come and pick her up, and I baptized her there just before I left St. Louis. But at any rate, she was just existing there in that nursing home. She wanted to be healed, of course, and she wanted to be baptized. But she was suspicious of those people there because they got her check, see? And they never gave her anything back from her check, her Social Security check. They just took it and used it, of course, to support her and to get what little things she needed. But she had gotten a number of cards over the past, 5 or 6 years from her relatives, none that lived very close, and she didn't have very many relatives left, as a matter of fact. They never came to see her. But she had them stuffed down in the side of that chair, a big, thick manila envelope full of birthday cards and Christmas cards and all kinds of cards. And she wanted me to take those and to go through them and take the money out of them. And all of them had $1 or $2 or $5. Some of them had $10. And she wanted me to just take them all and take that money and send it in to headquarters. She wanted to have a part of the work. And that's all she had. That's every penny and every dime that she had on earth. And she had nothing else there. She had nothing else. And I said, well, Iola, let me go downtown. Let me buy you something. Let me buy you something new. Let me just go to the store and buy you something. And she wouldn't hear of it. She wouldn't let me buy her anything. And so I took those things home, and, some of them were yellow and some of them were old, and I'd open them up and take the $1 or $2 out. And finally I got it all done, and, it just made me feel like a wretch because of my own selfishness and, my own attitude. I mean, I'm not even in a class with that type of person. I'm not even, even beginning to approach that type of attitude. But she she made me send it in. Of course, she wanted me to send it in because she didn't trust the people that were there in a nursing home to send it in because she was afraid they would take it and so forth. And she didn't want them to know she was sending in a donation. So it was about $130, I think. And I even asked her again, to let me buy her something. Let me get her something she needed. A new radio or a tape recorder or just anything, But she wouldn't. She wanted to have a part of the work. She just had been in contact with it so long and heard the broadcast so long, and she just felt that she wanted to have a part in getting that message out. And so I sent it all in for her. And she gave, she didn't give as we give of our increase, of our abundance, of our overflow. She gave every dime she had. And to me, that was, a superb example of dedication and of love. And when I think about what Christ said about that type of individual, you think about, I think that people like that probably are going to have some of the highest rewards in the kingdom of God. Some of the very highest, because they've suffered on this earth. They've been through hell already, as it were, and have been deserted and left alone. And here she was willing to give up everything. And of course, you see what a contrast it is to this individual that Christ is talking about here in Matthew 19, where he said, "Go and give up your career, as it were. Sell your farm and sell your cattle, and come and follow me, and be my disciple, and eventually an apostle." But he couldn't do it. He had too much to give up. He just had too much to give up. And that's true. The more you have, the harder it is to give up. The less you have, it seems, the more of that an individual seems to be willing to give up. And that, of course, is the danger of materialism, something that we certainly need to avoid. But this young man, getting back to the story here, fell far short of God's definition of love. He was a commandment keeper, though, notice. He had kept the commandments since he was a young man. And he had prospered as a result of keeping those commandments. He was probably a tither. He was probably very diligent and honest in his dealings. And again, as he said, he kept all the commandments. But he wasn't willing to follow the example or follow in the footsteps of Jesus Christ. So we get down to what is the nucleus? What is the definite? Oh, I'm running out of time here. 15 minutes to go. What is the nucleus? What is the strongest component of love? What would you say is the strongest component or part of love, if you want to put it that way? What did Christ require of his disciples that the rich young ruler lacked, or that even Judas Iscariot lacked? And even Judas was probably a commandment keeper, and he even followed Christ, didn't he? He followed Christ and came after him, but he still lacked something in the way of love. Over in John 21, I'm going to try to go through this as quickly as I can. Hope the nobles don't burst in on us here. In John 21, and this is after the crucifixion, after Christ had come back and been resurrected. And Peter, of course, in verse 3, Peter was always there. He was always seemingly the leader. He was always the one making these bold statements, I will never forsake you. God, I'll die for you. And of course, Christ said, you're not even going to stay with me. You're going to deny me 3 times the night of my betrayal. And Peter was always saying, he was coming out with some burst of commitment, and he never really was able to follow through on it. He was always committing himself. In chapter 21, he was the one to say, well, guys, let's go fishing. Let's go back. Let's go back to what we were doing. This cause is over with. This work is over with. Our leader is dead. It's all over with. And so let's go back and let's get back into the fishing industry. And so they would have. And they actually made an attempt to do that. And then Christ came to them over in verse 13. It said, Jesus then came and took bread and gave them, and fish likewise. This is now the 3rd time that Jesus showed himself to his disciples after that he was risen from the dead. So when they had dined, Jesus said to Simon Peter, he said, Simon, son of Jonas, he says, do you, agapeo, and that's the Greek word, agapeo, do you love me more than these, more than all these others, your brothers, and your, even maybe all the people of, all of Jewry, all of Jews? He said, do you agape, or agapeo me, do you love me more than these? And he said unto him, yes, Lord. He said, you know you're my friend. He said, you know I filio you. I have affection for you. You're a very close friend of mine. I admire you. I have a tender spot in my heart for you. You are my friend. I filio you. And he said unto him, okay, feed my lambs. Feed my people. Preach the word, in a sense, is what it said. That's what he was saying. Verse 16, he said unto him again the second time, Simon, son of Jonas, do you agapeo me? Do you agapeo me? And that's a different kind of love than just saying, I love you. You're my friend. You touch me. I have a feeling for you. I have an affection for you. Do you agapeo me? He said unto him, Yes, Lord. You know that I love you like a brother. I love you like a brother. He said unto him, Feed my sheep. He said unto him the third time, Simon, son of Jonas, he said, Are you really my friend? He said, Do you really have a feeling for me? Do you really phileo me? And Peter was grieved because Christ was really bearing down on him here, because he said unto him the third time, Do you really count me as a friend? Phileo. He had left the word agapeo now, and he'd gone back saying, Well, are you really my friend? He had left that stronger word, agapeo. And he came back, see, Christ had come back saying, Well, if you're really my friend. And Peter said unto him, Lord, you know all things. You know that I am your friend. He said unto him, Feed my sheep. Now, what was Christ saying here? And it is an interesting point that he asked him 3 times if he loved him. And of course, that's the number of times that he betrayed Christ or denied Christ, the night of his betrayal. So it's an interesting thing that he came back to that. And he was pointing out to Peter, look, you think you love me. You think you're committed, And so he was really bearing down on Peter. Of course, he had a special purpose in mind for Peter. But what was he saying when he said, Simon, son of Jonas, agapeo me? What was he saying? The word agapeo is different from phileo in this way. Agapeo means a complete devotion. A complete devotion and a complete commitment. It has to do with the mind. It's what you do in your mind. It is a commitment you make mentally. It is a complete and total commitment, and it is made through the assertion of the will. And it is a mental commitment. It is mental. You see, it is a stronger commitment. It is a stronger type of love, if you want to put it that way. It is a mental commitment. Now, all of us are familiar with phileo. Phileo. Philadelphia. Brotherly love. Phileo. We're all conscious of our feelings about the people we love. We know the people we love, and we're conscious of the feeling and emotion that we have for each other. And that's there. Of course, it fluctuates, doesn't it? It comes and goes. When newly marrieds are getting married or, first getting to know each other, young couples, they have a lot of phileo, and then the eros, which is sexual love. But phileo is a tenderness, it's an emotional kind of love, and it's certainly essential. I'm not saying that. It must be there. It must be there. And this is what Peter was saying about Christ. He said, You're my friend. I love you. You are my friend. He said, I'll do anything for you. You're my brother. He had the strong feeling there. But emotion is not stable. It comes and it goes, depending on the pressure that it has on it, doesn't it? And even in marriage, you think about it. The feelings come and go. There are times when that kind of phileo is stronger than it is at other times. Sometimes it almost wanes away completely. But it is the agapeo that holds you in there, isn't it? It is the commitment. It is that stronger part of love that keeps the emotion steady. Even though emotion fluctuates, the agapeo is steady. It is a total commitment and devotion until death. You see, so there is a difference. There are 2 components then to love. Agapeo and phileo. Phileo is friendship, feelings, affection. I wouldn't hurt you for anything type attitude. Agapeo is complete devotion and commitment for life. It has to do with the will. But you see, you have one. If you were to have one, if you had total commitment to someone without any feeling, then that wouldn't be enough either. And a lot of times we think that is enough. But it's not. The feeling should be there. It is important to have tenderness, tenderheartedness, kindness, gentleness. Galatians 5:20, see? All of that emotional love. That is important. That is essential. You know, if our love was just plain, flat, commitment, sure, we may die for somebody. But if that other part is not there, then, what good would it do if we give our bodies to be burned? It wouldn't do much good at all, would it? The same way if we only had emotional love without the commitment. That's what Peter had. That's what Peter had for Christ. And that's what we see in the world today among young people. They have a love and an affection for each other and a tenderness. But when that fluctuates and when it takes a dip, because there is not a strong commitment there, there's not a strong commitment of the will, then they break up. And this is what happens. This is what happens not only with married people, but friends, because that commitment is not there. They allow too many other things to affect the relationship without remembering that love is commitment. Commitment. Commitment until death. Commitment until death. Never forsaking. Matthew 28:19 and 20. Christ said, I will never leave you or forsake you. And He did not qualify that. He did not say, I will leave you and forsake you if you do this and if you do that and you do the other. He said, I will never leave you or forsake you. He said, well, of course, we all realize that we can leave and forsake God. That's true. But God said He would never turn His back on us. And it's usually we who break our commitment and certainly not God. And of course, this goes back to the concept of Matthew 22:37, where we're told to love God with all of our heart and with all of our soul and with all of our mind, mentally, physically, emotionally, a total and complete dedication. Heart and soul and mind. It's a total thing. It involves feeling and it involves commitment. We need to ask ourselves if we're seeking continually to renew and solidify our commitment to God and to each other. Are we doing what Christ told us to do? Are we seeking out those footprints in the pages of the Bible, and are we putting our feet one by one in those footprints? Are we saying, no, I'm going to do it my way? And we could turn to any number of examples. The Bible, the whole New Testament is full of specific things that Christ said, do this like this. Do it this way. And of course, one prime example is Matthew 18 and 15. He said, when you have human problems, when you have troubles come up between you, solve them between yourselves. Go to each other and settle it. Solve it on that level. Of course, as I said before, when we find ourselves in that situation, when we've been offended, what we usually do is we do it our way. We go around somebody's back, or over their head, or under, or any way except the way Christ said do it. Don't we? Terrible. And yet Christ said, do it this way. But we, of course, want to better Christ's command. We want to better what He said do. Of course, it won't work. And we're going to defeat the whole purpose of what He commanded if we try to do it our way. We will. We'll have a totally diametrically opposite effect of what we're trying to accomplish. It will not do anything but tear down. Of course, love should build up. Love should build up into a huge, beautiful structure. But if we try to do it our way, it's going to tear it down. And this is why we need to have a common definition of love. We need to know what it is, and we need to all follow through specifically. Christ said in Matthew 25:35 to 40, read it yourself. He said, when you do things to each other, for each other, He said, see me in the other person. You're doing it to me or for me if you're doing it for the other individual. And are we doing anything? Are we just trying to be good, as it were? Are we more devoted to our own righteousness than the other person's righteousness? Matthew 10 and verse 39. I can't turn there, but it says something like, he that seeks his life will lose it. But he that loses his life or gives it up for my sake, will have eternal life. Now that's one of those scriptures that doesn't make human sense, but it is true. It is very true. And again, that involves commitment, total commitment and devotion. Total devotion to God and to our fellow men. James 1:27. Pure religion and undefiled is this. What? Two parts there, isn't it? One has to do with commandment keeping. One part of religion is to keep yourself pure. Keep yourself unspotted from the world. Keep the commandments. The other part, the filling up of it, says, go out and visit the widow and the orphan in their affliction. This is pure religion. So one is going above and beyond and filling up the law. It's love. It's overflowing. The other is simply commandment keeping, but you've got to have both. You've got to have both. You must have it. Or you won't be anything but a Christian in name. Very simple. 1 Corinthians 13. I'm trying to finish. Is anybody at the door? Okay. I intended to bring another translation of this, and I'm sorry that I forgot it. But when you get home or sometime this week, read it in the Living Bible or read it in several other translations. Paul was talking about a more excellent way here. He's talking about how desirous we often are. A lot of times we wish I could be an apostle. I wish I could prophesy. I wish I could foretell the future. I wish I could teach. I wish I could preach. I wish I could heal. How many times have you heard people say that? Wish I had the power to heal. I wish I had the power to speak in tongues. I wish I could do some great thing for the work. And Paul says, I'm going to show you a more excellent way, above and beyond all those special gifts. In verse 31 of chapter 12, 1 Corinthians, continuing in chapter 13 and verse 1, he says, though I speak with tongues of men and angels and have not love, agapeo here, the affection plus the commitment, the emotional feeling of tenderness and kindness for other people, plus a deep commitment. He said, I am become as a sounding brass and a tinkling cymbal. Now, what Paul is trying to say in this whole chapter here is this. Love can be faked. It can be faked. Now, you can do things. You can go out and do things that look like love. And, when you read about, a little bit further down here, I'll get to it in a minute. It says, though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries, I have a perfect understanding of the Bible, of God's plan, all knowledge, and have all faith, that I could remove mountains and have not love. Agapeo. If I'm not devoted to my fellow man and putting him first and promoting him, putting his needs, his desires, his life above mine, he said, that doesn't do me any good. Doesn't do me any good. I am nothing, he says. And though I bestow all of my goods to feed the poor, some guy did this a few years ago. He converted into cash and gave away over $1 million. Threw it out. Bought food and everything else. Says, though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned and have not love, it profits me nothing. You know about this lady that was in the news over in Switzerland, I believe. Was it Switzerland? Bern, Switzerland? I don't know where it was. But she was part of this movement. This kind of anti-United Nations. United Nations is not doing its job movement. And she was the daughter of a wealthy person in Australia. Family. And so she felt like, of course, she was showing love. She was going to demonstrate her love, and she sat down there in the front of this particular building, poured a can of gasoline over, and struck a match. Burned herself to death right there, before anybody could even grab an extinguisher and put it out. And it reminds you of what Paul is saying here. Though I give my body to be burned as an act of love, and I really am not committed, I am getting glory for it. My name is going in the headlines, and I am being recognized and lauded for doing a great, selfless, self-sacrificing act. If I don't have the love, if I don't really have the love, if I'm not really motivated by devotion and affection, commitment, I'm not doing you a bit of good. All you've done is lost your life. All you've done is lost your life. So you see, there is a difference. Love can be faked. I can fake it. You can fake it. And only God knows for sure if you're showing it. Not your hairdresser. Your hair counter. Only your hair counter knows for sure if you're motivated by love or not. Nobody else knows. And sometimes we even kid ourselves. We think that we are motivated by love when actually we're motivated by vanity. We want recognition. We want to feel good. We do things to make us feel good. We give things to people because it makes us feel good. And that's wrong. That's not love. Now, it's okay to feel good about it. You shouldn't feel bad about it. But if you're doing it to get the good feeling, then that's not a right motivation either. And we need to ask ourselves, what motivates us? Is it our real sincere desire to see other people reach their fullest godly potential? As Paul said, I could wish myself accursed if Israel could be saved, if my fellow man could be saved. I wonder if we have that devotion. Would we give up our eternal life? Now we think, oh yeah, I would. But we don't know, do we? We haven't been put to the test yet. We haven't been tried yet. We will be sometime in the future. I firmly believe it. And we may even be given a choice as to how to prove that. I don't know. I'm not making that as a dogmatic statement. We may have an opportunity to give our life, though. I don't know. Some of us might. Many of us will be protected. Charity suffers long. It's extremely patient. It is kind. Charity envies not. Charity does not build itself up, and it is not puffed up. It does not behave itself unseemly. It does not seek its own. Is not easily provoked, and thinks no evil. Love thinks no evil. When's the last time you thought evil? When is the last time you assumed evil? When is the last time you assumed an evil motive of someone else? Love thinks no evil. Rejoices not in iniquity or in sin, but rejoices in the truth. Rejoices when truth wins out. Endures all things. Charity never gives up. It never wears out. It never comes to an end. This kind of love is total commitment forever. And it's godly love. It's godly commitment. Whether there be tongues or whatever other gifts, he said, they shall cease. Whether there be knowledge, it shall vanish away. We know in part and we prophesy in part, but when that which is perfect is come, then that which is in part shall be done away. It says, when I was a child, I spoke as a child. I understood as a child, I thought as a child, but when I become a man, I put away a childish way of looking at things and speaking about things and viewing things. He said, and now we see through a glass darkly, vaguely, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then shall I know even as also I am known. And now abides faith, hope, and charity. These three, but the greatest of all is charity. Agapeo, love, feeling, devotion, and commitment. It must be all of those things. And it must go far beyond just being good. You see, Christianity is far more than being good. This is why Christ said, that it's not enough just to be righteous as the Pharisees are righteous. They were very legalistic, in their approach. He said, you're going to have to go far beyond their righteousness if you're ever going to be in the kingdom of God. And I wonder, if we haven't gotten ourselves into a rut where we're just satisfied with being good. Having a clean conscience when we go to bed at night, or a conscience that's not guilty of having done some sin. Having not thought an evil thought, or having, not paid our tithes, or having not used God's name in vain, or having not kept the Sabbath, or having not coveted or stolen, or some other of the Ten Commandments. If we're not guilty, feeling a little bit guilty about what we have left undone, as far as our devotion to each other, see if you can think when you go to bed at night, if you can name to yourself the widows, see if you can name the shut-ins, see if you can name the orphans, and ask yourself, when is the last time you visited these people in their need? And ask yourself, sure you have feeling, but ask yourself the same question that Christ asked Peter. Do you agapeo me? Are you really committed to me and devoted to me? If you are, then feed my sheep. Feed each other.
Additional programs and literature available at hwalibrary.com.